Hey folks, Rue Campbell here for Threadscape, and in this podcast, I pick into the mind of Joe Hosty, who works at Threadscape as a Microsoft Security automation and integration engineer. We cover a whole bunch of cool things, specifically on the Graph API. We cover stuff that new folks about it need to know. We cover some of the quirks and features of it and the intricacies, and then some mistakes and things that you should want to avoid. So let's get into it. So what's the one key thing you think of when you think of the graph that a lot of folks might know about, but they would find incredibly useful?
So I think probably the main thing about the graph that is useful for people to know is just the scale of the capabilities that you can get from it. From something very simple, like you're just an admin who wants to export a list of users in your organization, to a developer who wants to develop a full-scale third-party application on top of the M365.
Okay. And so really the key thing is, like, if I want to make the move from doing things one by one to doing them at scale,
yes,
that's the core justification behind learning graph. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So if you're in an organization or anywhere where, for example, if you've got multiple tenants that you're using, so if you're looking at conditional access policies, there's no way with looking through the user interface in the M365 portal to see conditional access policies or act on conditional access policies in one tenant, in two tenants at the same time. Whereas with the Graph API, you can scale that up infinitely, and you can work with two tenants at the same time. You can work with three tenants at the same time, all the way up. So if you're doing one thing lots of times, then like you can basically save all of that time by just doing it once with the Graph API.
Gotcha. And so conditional access is a good example because it doesn't support multi-tenant out the box in the same way something like Defender does. And so is the kind of core use case for that, like, well, I'll tell you what, I mean, you're a developer, so obviously dev work, but then sysadmins and all that kind of stuff as well, just throwing together normal scripts. Like, who's the audience in that particular scenario?
So that's the audience is so large. So from the sysadmin point of view, if you just look at conditional access policies, it could be something like there's a new setting in conditional access policies, or there's a new recommendation where this setting should be turned off. And if you've got 100, if you're just in one tenant, you've got 100 conditional access policies that you've got to look through just to find that one setting. It'd be a lot easier if you can just create a script, it looks through all those conditional access policies, and it returns value if that setting is set to true or set to false, so that you can act on that recommendation. So that's sort of the sysadmin level of capability or things that you can do with the graph. And then all the way up to a developer, if you want to develop a third-party application which is looking at mailboxes, for example, and you want to use AI or LLMs to determine if an email is malicious based on the content of the email and the language in that email, then you can use the Graph API to extract the data and the message from an email, use the LLMs that you've got built on in your third-party application, and then make a decision on that email, and then act upon it and go back to Microsoft M365, go back to Outlook and use the graph to say, hey, this email's malicious. We've done all this investigation, all this work, all this development work using code that's been scripted outside of M365, and then act upon it and go back and remediate that risk within M365.
Well, and I guess that brings me on to the point about permissions and things over Graph API. You mentioned mailbox access there, so that's obviously something that's quite sensitive, I guess would be the word that comes to mind. And if let's take a step back and let's just say I'm a sysadmin and I want to write some scripts that leverage the Graph API to do stuff to mailboxes, whatever it is. What are the security things that I need to know? Because I'll tell you this, I mean, I know, for example, that you can't really just connect and run this thing, right? You got to do consent flows and all that kind of stuff. So what's the full process that folks need to know there?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think a good way to measure the security aspect of the Graph API is probably by looking at another SaaS solutions API security. And so the sort of standard security that you'd have for like a project management tool where you're trying to get data via an API is that you'd set up an account, a user account, and you'd give that account developer access, and you get an API token. And that token is effectively just a password, which if anyone has access to that token, they can then query the API from that project management solution and get the data. So that token is literally a password. Anyone who has that token has the keys to the kingdom. And that's resulted in lots of data breaches. I think the Uber breach a couple of years ago was the result of an access token that was published to a private repository, and someone who had access to that repository saw the token and then had the keys to the kingdom and can go to Uber's AWS environment and get all the data from there. So one of the things, as well as permissions like you mentioned, that you get with Microsoft Graph from a security point of view, is that those tokens don't have to be used in plain text. You can authenticate, like I say, as a user. So if I sent you a script that I've written, like we said earlier with the conditional access policies, you can just authenticate as Rue Campbell. As long as Rue Campbell's got those permissions, then you can run that script and it's fine. There's no password in that script, which is a real plus. You can also use things as certificates. So as an application, that's much more secure compared to things like client secrets or access tokens that you put in environmental variables. You can set a managed identity that can then authenticate to a key vault, get those certificates, and then you're nice and authenticated in that way. And then it comes down to the permissions, where once you authenticated, you only get access to specifically what you need. So like I said, access to mailboxes, if it's a email security application, and you're a developer or not a developer, you're an admin for a company who's setting up an email security application in your tenant, you only want them to have access to mailboxes. There's no need for them to have access to your conditional access policies or your device compliance policies. So you can give them just that access and nothing else. And you can be really, really granular, and you can just say you can only read the access to mailboxes. You can't write mail as well. And that mitigates lots of risks further down the line, because if that application gets compromised, then, or that company who is in charge of that application gets compromised, then they have read-write permissions to your mailboxes. They can send emails from users in your authentications mailboxes. So by controlling those permissions and only giving them read access, you can mitigate that risk completely.
Understood. So a few things going on there. The main one that jumps out to me is that it's just a long-standing principle of least privilege, I guess, right? As far as only give the app what it needs. And one of the things that comes to mind for me then is I don't want to harp on developers or take any cheap digs at developers, but quite often you'll see.
Hey, watch out.
Yeah, I know. Hey, you're on the winning team here, but I know that. What would you say? There may be a perception sometimes that developers may ask for more permissions than is really necessary because it makes the job easier, right? Yeah. If you just give me global admin, I'll be able to do anything, right? And therefore that makes my life a little bit easier. So in your work, when you've been working on developing things with the graph, is that easy, right? So for example, to me, the easy thing would be just give me all the permissions, give me global admin, give me God mode. But I know I want to do least privilege. Have you had challenges around following that least principle model, or is it kind of easy enough to do within the Graph API?
That's the thing that's great about Microsoft in general, is the documentation is so good. So if one of the sort of workflows that I would go through is, if I've got a bit of work that I need to do, I need to get this bit of data from Microsoft, I can inspect the web page, I can get that endpoint that I need to query, and straight away I can Google search that endpoint. The first link that comes up is the Microsoft documentation, which shows exactly what permissions that I will need for that graph endpoint. And I can use the Graph Explorer tool is something that's really good for that as well, where once you go to the Graph Explorer, you put in that endpoint and you can query the data from that endpoint on a demo tenant that Microsoft has set up. It shows you all the permissions as well in there. So all the full permissions that you'd need, from the least privilege to the full access that you'd get for that specific endpoint. And then it gives you some sample data as well, which is really useful for testing out that code before you go to use live data on a live tenant. So before you've set up the authentication, authorization, like we spoke about before.
Right. Okay, so documentation steers you in the right direction. And I guess because one of the things you also mentioned there is you query these endpoints. So you know what endpoint you want, you punch it into the Graph Explorer, and it would,
yes,
or the documentation would give you the data of the permissions that were needed. How do you find those endpoints in the first place? How do you know, hey, here's the string or the URL or the endpoint that I need to get what I want? Is that also in the documentation, or what's the process?
So that can be quite tricky. It's documented quite well, relatively well, but the best way of doing it is just inspecting the page using developer tools in the browser. So that's looking at the browser, where the browser is going to get that data. That's all documented in the developer tools. So you can sort of look and find the exact endpoint there. And that's how I've found the best way of really getting to the source of the truth. But the documentation is pretty good as well.
Okay, so when you mentioned developer tools, school sysadmins like me start getting scared because I'm like, hey, it's got dev in it. That's nothing to do with me. What is the full process there? Because is it, I guess it's like we're at that stage now where the dev and the admin, they're so overlinked now and you can't kind of escape it. So what's the explain it to me like I'm 5 version of using dev tools to get information from the graph?
Yeah. So it's simple. If you wanted if you're looking at device compliance policies in the browser, you can then use the dev tools. So you press Control, Shift, and I, and that comes up with the dev tools in Edge. And you go to Network. And in that Network tab, it basically just shows you where the front end is going or what it's querying to get the data that is then presenting you in that Intune portal. So if you reload the page, then you'll get this long sort of log file. It's not quite a log file, but or stream of data showing once you reloaded that page, the browser went to graph.microsoft.api /beta/devices/device compliance policies. And I'm like, cool. That's where my browser got the data from. I can just copy and paste that, go to Graph Explorer. Cool. The data looks like that. I need this permissions. I can set up my application, or I can set up my user to have those permissions, and the data looks like this. I can use this test data to then create the scripts that I need to perform whatever I need to perform on that data.
Okay, that makes sense. And one of the things I'll pick apart about what you said is you mentioned that kind of, it shows you the endpoint that the front end is querying to get that data. So
yes,
when we talk about things like Intune Admin Center, Entra Admin Center, those are just front ends, abstractions over and above this back end, which is the graph. Is that?
Yeah, a good way. Yeah, maybe a way of thinking about it is like the front end. If you just go to a spreadsheet, the front end is like the table and the charts and the graph that shows you things in a nice, pretty way. So if you're looking at someone's height compared to their age, you'd have a nice chart showing a trend line of someone's height compared to their age. But if you want to get to the actual raw data underneath that, you've got to go to that spreadsheet where it's just a load of a column and rows of the data. That is the back end. So the Graph API is we're going and getting that data. We're not looking at those pretty user interface.
So the Graph API is like the middleware between going in and pulling out that data and then chucking it back.
Exactly. It's the way to access that raw data.
Okay, understood. And when you get that raw data, what does that look like? Because I've heard the joke, it's a joke I've stolen about 100 times, so I don't know whoever said it first of all, but it's a good joke and I've stolen it, that when you look at something like 365, it's really just like, it's JSON files all the way down. Like this thing is just billions and billions of JSON files. Is that what you're getting when you query these endpoints?
It's where all the fun starts, really. It's a load of JSON. Yeah, it's a load of JSON data, especially from the Graph API. It's JSON data. If you're querying it from the Exchange Online Management PowerShell, it can come out in PowerShell, so it comes out as PS custom objects, but you can also get it to come out as JSON objects. But it's all in different formats, and that's just from the nature of the fact that Microsoft or M365 is built up of lots of different products that are all sort of amalgamated together. So it's really tricky. What you want to do, or what I really want as a lazy developer, is once I've queried conditional access policies and I'm looking for a setting that's been changed, and because it's from a recommendation, we need to find this setting and make sure that it's this value. Okay, cool. I've set up that script now. I can run this script. I can look for this setting in conditional access policies. Awesome. And it gives me a good result if it's set to the wrong value. I want to then be able to use that script that I've created and use that for something like antivirus policies. But unfortunately, because the structure of the data is the same, I can't just change the endpoint and change the name of the setting and say, go find this setting, which you do if the data was all structured nice and the same. You'd just be able to use the same script for everything with a few little changes. Because the data is structured very differently, you've got to then create a whole new script. So it can be very difficult. But I can't complain too much because the fact that it's difficult is literally the reason that I'm in a job.
Okay, so that's a good point. And I'll maybe come back to that one because it is, it's always the thing about IT. It's like the challenge of using something is almost always directly related to the career opportunities that come about as a result of it, right? So I'll definitely come back to that point. But I guess just to clarify then, so it's fair to say that when you're working with the graph in 365, kind of can't take anything for granted in terms of what you're getting back until you've verified it. So just because I've cracked whatever method I want to get and manage something like a compliance policy, if I then want to go and do something over in the Purview Admin Center or the Entra side of things, potentially wildly different. Is that the...
Exactly. But that's why you've got tools like the Graph Explorer, where you can get that sample data really easily, and you can then curate and create scripts based on the output of that data. So it's difficult, but there's ways around it, and it's a well-known difficulty.
So on that point then of well-known difficulties, in terms of things that you have learned through your time working with Graph API, does anything jump out to you as, wish I'd known that when I started doing all this because it would make your life easier? Or just that general kind of, what's something that is a real quality of life improver for listeners and viewers?
That's a good question. I think there's lots of little things. To try and pick out one main thing is probably pretty difficult. I think the main thing is just with is just testing and using the little things that are there to help, like the Graph Explorer, like the changelog. So any changes that happen within Microsoft Graph are really well documented, as you can imagine. So once you've created those scripts, after you've curated the script, you want to make sure that they keep working. If you've got that script that's looking for settings that are changing based on recommendations, or you've got a script which is looking for users that have become inactive after a certain amount of time, if that graph endpoint is changed, then you're going to have to change the script. So little things like looking at the Graph Explorer for data, making sure you keep track of the change log in Microsoft Graph to make sure that you're on top of any changes that happen.
That's a really good point, because if you're kind of developing apps and scripts that leverage this service and then Microsoft go away and change something, that could break a business process, right? So what's the, is that, and geez, how do I put this diplomatically? Is that well managed and communicated? Because it's kind of a well-known meme that every time you sign into 365, something looks different and you had no idea that change was coming. Is that similar with the Graph API?
Well, yes, but fortunately, because there's so many applications which are built on top of the Graph API, Microsoft knows they've got to keep it pretty well documented and keep everyone very well informed. Hence, the changelog is really a Bible to go by. So it's pretty good. And also going back to that whole sort of spreadsheet example where you've got the actual charts and graphs and then the raw data behind it, there might be loads of changes that are going on the front end. So it could be just the color of the interface, the color of the web page has changed, but in the back end, nothing's changed. That raw data is still the same. So it can seem like there's loads of changes going on in the M365 portal, but that back end's staying the same, actually.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. One of the other things that I'd love to pick your brains about is there's, hopefully my language is correct here, there's two endpoints, right? As far as you get beta, and then is it called 1.0 or something like that?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
First off, am I using the right terminology? Is that what you call them? Endpoints? Is that the right? And then when should I use which? Because when I look at the docs, I see tons of stuff in the beta and I'm kind of like, I want to use it, but is it safe to use it? So what's your thoughts there?
So again, this is me going, I basically use whatever Microsoft is using. So when I say that I go and inspect the portal to see exactly where that portal is going to get its data, if the portal is using the beta endpoint, then I can be pretty sure that the beta endpoint is secure and not going to be changing all the time because Microsoft themselves are using it. So that's my sort of litmus test. So that's why I said the best thing to use is the inspection from the dev tools in the browser. So that means that it's an amalgamation of beta and 1.0 endpoints that I would use generally in scripts that I would curate. So yeah, basically the only exception to that rule is there may be some things which are available in the beta endpoint compared to the 1.0. So if it's something that I need that is in the beta endpoint that isn't in the 1.0, then I have to use the beta endpoint because it's only there.
And one other thing that comes to mind to me is that there's so much stuff that you might want to access programmatically, but it's not in the Graph API, right? So one example that comes to mind for me is a lot of Exchange settings from like a kind of admin or service level. My understanding is you can't get to those through the Graph API. You can access mailboxes and things, but let's say I wanted to set up an anti-spam policy or something like that. Well, it's just not available. I guess the question then comes to mind for me is, are there more APIs that Microsoft 365 admins should know and be familiar with? Or what's the full catalog of options then to access stuff like that?
That's correct. So there's the Exchange Online Management. I suppose it's an API, but it's a PowerShell module. So somewhere in the PowerShell code, there is an endpoint that is being queried. But effectively, the way to get there is through PowerShell commandlets. So that's the way that you would access data for anything to do with Exchange Online or Purview, not through Graph. Now, my knowledge or my understanding is that Microsoft is trying to move things over to Graph and away from Exchange Online. So that's one way in which you want to access data from M365 that isn't through Graph, but you can still get. And there's the security API as well, which also provides data that's in the security portal. But again, I think that's the idea is that moves over to the Graph API.
I know in the Defender side and the security side, it does get really messy because Defender for Endpoint's got its own API, and there's a threat protection API that he still uses the old name of something like Windows Defender Threat Protection instead of Defender XDR. It just gets really, really messy, right? And that makes me think, to your point earlier, where you're talking about the complexity, or dare I say the kind of the intimidation factor when it comes to this kind of thing. Obviously, you've been able to carve a career, and that's really your niche now, right? Is specializing on this kind of thing. How do you stumble into something like this, right? Because, well, I mean, I know, for example, that you don't come from a conventional help desk / sysadmin background like I do. So what's your career lessons then to folks that might be listening to this and thinking, okay, well, how can I leverage the Graph API to kind of put myself first and improve my career?
I think the way I stumbled into this is I've got an inability to say no to things. I did maths at university, so I did a lot of programming and coding at university, and then I started working in tech. And then basically just put one and two together, that the sort of stuff that I was doing and working and doing on a day-to-day basis, I could sort of, light bulb went off. I could use the coding knowledge that I have to help make my life easier and other people's easier by using that programming to help bring value to the day-to-day tasks that people do. So like you said, it's quite a niche career. It's a very niche career, but the core application of what I do is very applicable. It's taking something and just trying to make it better and more usable for the end user. I think advice that I would have is probably, if I went back in time to myself when I was first started working, or something that I feel like I've done well, is that if I've got a gut feeling for things, then just to go with it. So a lot of the time, I think your gut feeling is right. That's very vague advice.
No, listen, it's vague advice, but it's kind of true, right? I've always got this, ironically, I guess, I've always got this gut feeling that your gut feeling is the right thing to follow, right? And so far, it's like you usually know deep down whether something's right for you or not, right?
Yeah.
And look, the bottom line is like your career is one of a handful of the most important decisions you're ever going to make. And if you don't feel it in your gut and in your body, maybe you're not doing something right.
Yeah, exactly. And it's what you're passionate about. I did a talk. I went back to the university that I went to. I did a talk for people who did my course, and they were asking lots of questions on careers. And a lot of the questions were based on money. They were based on, where they're working. They're based on if it's a 4-day week or not. They're based on, I was just saying, if you actually find somewhere or something that you enjoy doing what you're doing, or in a company where you feel content and you like the people that you're working with, that for me is you're working from 9 to 5. So that's really important, because if you go somewhere and you want to leave, you want a 4-day week, you're not going to be doing valuable work. You're not going to be progressing throughout your career. If you find somewhere that you feel comfortable and you find somewhere that you really enjoy, you're going to just naturally, over the course of 2, 3, 4, 5 years, just keep progressing and keep going. But if you're automatically just looking at money or just looking at how can I work less and less for more money, then the opposite effect happens where you end up doing less and less and less and less, and your career sort of progresses less and less and less.
It's kind of the counterintuitive thing where it's like, well, actually, don't focus on trying to do less work, focus on doing more work that you actually enjoy to the point where it doesn't feel so much like work, I guess, right? That's the key thing. And when you're working with things like Graph API, it's like you're just problem solving nonstop, right? And the reward you get when you finally crack it, to me, that's always a great feeling in our line of work. It's just you have a problem, you chip away at it, and boom, finally you make a little bit of progress. And it's that feeling of like victory. It's far more motivating quite often than the money is.
No, you're exactly right. It's join the dots. So also, I get, like I was saying, the way development works is you'll get given a ticket or you get given a task like, oh, this is what we need to do. Can you then go away and programmatically do it? And you've got to sort of create a long roadmap of tasks to do to get to that end goal. And that end goal is the reward that you get. You're like, oh, I've done all these steps. I've gone and found the data here. I've then passed the data in this way and that way and presented it like this. And from that result, the end users can then get exactly what they need. Or the company that we're working for is much more secure. I've saved Rue 10 hours of his time because he's not doing the same task across 10 organizations. He's only doing it once. So yeah, that's the rewarding feeling. But it's very hard to explain to people when it's like, what do you do for work? It's like, I integrate software.
Yeah, there's a whole thing about how when you work in tech, that's fundamentally it's a different language, right? And I think a lot of careers are like that. I always think that finance and IT, for example, are quite similar in the fact that you know what they do, but you don't really have a clue what they do. They get their own systems and their own language and their own, I don't know, little quirks and features, right? A bit like IT does. But no, that's really cool. That's a great lesson. And I mean, so going back to your point where you mentioned you're kind of speaking at university and telling folks are looking to carve out their own career, right? About stuff like this. What's the kind of concluding thought then for folks that they're at that graduation stage? They're wondering, hey, what do I do next? What's your parting words of wisdom to these folks?
The first thing, if I was at that point, is that don't worry. Like a lot of people that I know went to graduating from university, the job that they went into that initial one was just the wrong fit for that. So it's almost like be okay with being wrong. You know, that first wrong step is sort of like you need to know which way not to go in order to go the right way to start with. So it's like, okay, that didn't work out. But I've learned all this about myself, where I want to work, who I want to work with, what sort of industry I work in, so that now I know, okay, I want to go in this direction. So for me, that was, I didn't quite like this area that I was working on. I didn't quite like this part of the company I was working in. It didn't quite work out for me, but I've been exposed to all these different parts of an organization, different parts of ways to work, whether it be remote, in the office. I'll work better like this. I can now look in that direction. So even though something can seem like a failure, like that first job, maybe it doesn't work out, you can turn it into a success. And it is sort of a success if you learn from it.
Love it. Well, very well said. It's like, I think back to when I was younger coming out of university, and I had such a craving to just get something nice and orderly and comfortable as soon as possible. But in hindsight, I'm like, nah, just embrace the chaos, embrace choosing the wrong job, embrace kind of jumping to loads of different jobs to just figure it out, right? Because you'll figure it out faster by making a mess of it and choosing the wrong decision, because it'll inform your decisions better later on.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a lot of how I do development. So I'll do the code. It doesn't work. It's terrible. And then from all those errors, I'll be like, well, is there anything that did work in there? That worked. Okay, we'll start from there and we'll build it out.
Okay, cool. Right, that's really good to hear. Sounds like we're very much on the same page with regards to what the young ones should do with their career. Good grief, that makes me feel old. So anyway, Joe, it's been awesome having you on. Really like picking your brains apart with the Graph API. I learned quite a lot. I especially got that kind of distinction between beta and 1.0 endpoint. You know, I have a little bit less fear about using the beta endpoint. If folks want to follow you online, see the kind of stuff you're up to, where's the best place for them to connect with you?
LinkedIn's the best place. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, listen, appreciate you joining me, and I'll catch up with you soon.
No worries. Thanks, Rue. Cheers.
Cheers.